Hello, hey, welcome back. We are at day 2 of Creative Days Vienna. If you are just joining us, hi, my name is Adia, and if you were with us yesterday, get ready, we have another amazing program for you in store today. Last night had some really terrible joke I was gonna make about science fiction and androids sleeping of electric sheep, and I decided not to do that and just get into the program because no one needs to hear that. So we're gonna jump right into things today because, like I said, we have another full day of digital experiences, more talks, more adventures, and yeah, I'm getting excited. So if you're with us, you understand that when we are talking about the future of culture and technology, we are implicitly speaking about change, flexibility, and the need for constant improvisation. Few artistic forms demand this type of movement nor have the ability to impact us with such a surprising amount of emotional immediacy as does the medium of theater, which is why we've asked our next presenter to join us and speak with us today. Dead Center, the name of the conceptual theater group founded by Bush, Moukarzel, and Ben Kidd, describe themselves as making things in theaters. And this is where I hesitate to even use the word theater group as a descriptive for what it is that they actually create. At the root of all of their multilateral stagings lay performances and moments that explore intrinsically what it means to be human. And moreover, what it means to be human in the face of rapid technological advancement and change. Their project, LIPPY, created in 2012, was developed at London's National Theatre Studio and premiered in 2013. It became the winner of the Irish Times Theatre Award for Best Production, a Fringe First, a Herald Angel, a Total Theatre Award, received 2 OBIE Awards. And though based between Dublin and London, their productions have toured the world and premiered at venues such as the Young Vic in London, Schaubühne, Berlin, Edinburgh, New York, Gothenburg, Wuzhen, China, and Brisbane, Australia. They've made work for internationally renowned ensembles, and in 2020, they created To Be a Machine, version 1.0, which was streamed live to audiences at home in Dublin. It has since toured virtually to Théâtre de Liège. The German language version, The Maschine in Mir, was created for BurgTheater here in Vienna, featuring Michael Maertens, and premiered on New Year's Eve in 2020. It was through this recent production of To Be a Machine version 1.0 that they addressed themes of transhumanism within the added context of needing to find ways to create an accessible and connective theater experience despite worldwide lockdowns due to a global pandemic. What came out of that, and as a result of their desire to always push the boundaries of what theater is and what it can be and what it can do, led ultimately to a broader reflection as to how we may in the future interact with spatial and audience-dependent settings within the performing arts. I will now hand the floor over to Ben. Hi, Ben, Artistic Director of Dead Center, who will tell you more about the making of that project, and he's also going to talk to you a bit about his thoughts on future experiences. He's also going to join us live immediately afterwards for a Q&A. So with that in mind, I'm giving the floor over to Ben now. Hi, Ben.
Hi, Adia. How are you?
Good. Nice to see you.
Good stuff. Good afternoon. My name is Ben Kidd. I'm co-artistic director of the theatre company Dead Center. And I'm speaking to you today from my home in Dublin, Ireland, where we're based. Hello. It's slightly uncanny that I can't see anyone, but I hope you're out there, and thanks for coming, whatever that means in this day and age. I want to start, unfortunately, with an apology. Seems like a good place to start, because joining me here should be the other co-artistic director of the company, Bush Moukarzel. But in fact, we have just returned home from Vienna. Or to be more specific, I have. Bush was unfortunate while we were there to catch COVID while we were working and has been stranded for the last 3 weeks. He finally managed to get a negative test a couple of days ago. He had to rearrange his flight and it leaves, I think, in about half an hour. So he sends his apologies, but he is not here, which, although frustrating, is actually somewhat appropriate for what I'm going to talk about. As Adia said, we are called Dead Center. It's basically the two of us. We began making work in 2012, somewhat by accident. We never intended to form a company, and we didn't begin making work in accordance with any grand manifesto or set of ideas. As so often in life, if we're all completely honest, chance and instinct played a huge part in the decision to make work together. However, as we stop and every so often look back on the work we've made in lots of different contexts, there do seem to be some recurring thematic and formal interests. The project I'm going to talk about mostly is a project that we made firstly in English in September 2020 called To Be a Machine. As Adia said, it was a project which we then adapted into German for BurgTheater in December 2020, retitled Die Maschine in mir. And this project was a response, in a way, to the unprecedented situation that theatre and the whole world found itself in as a result of the pandemic. And it seemed to us, when asked to talk to you guys, that in fact this project also seemed to represent an intersection of many, and in particular of two, key thematic interests and ideas that we have always, perhaps unknowingly, tried to follow. Back then, last year, faced with a global lockdown, the challenge to theatre was how to continue with live performance when we weren't even allowed to leave our homes. How you could make sense of trying to reach an audience when people were forbidden to gather in large groups. We became interested in the question about whether theatre was really possible at all under such conditions, whether it could adapt, evolve and expand its strategies of storytelling to the new situation, and whether it really continued to be theatre if it did that. So I'm going to speak mostly about that project. But firstly, even though this is a day about the future, and a day for thinking about the future, I'm going to start a little bit further back and talk about some of our other projects and to try and establish how we've been guided by these two particular thematic concerns. So firstly, one of our major interests and one of the things that has really been a guiding principle for us is something we refer to as casting the audience. It's quite an idiomatic English phrase, casting the audience, giving the audience a role, I suppose. Theatre, as a medium, is completely dependent on the audience, we believe, in a way that very few other art forms really are, of course. Filmmakers make films for an audience, of course. Designers design clothes for an audience. You know, going to the movies is much more exciting if you're with an audience, but for us and for our interests, theatre has a very particular dependence on the audience. One of the most frustrating things about starting to make theatre is that, unlike film or a lot of visual arts, you can't really learn from the history of the form very easily. Okay, in recent years, more and more stuff has been filmed, but for the vast majority of the history of the form in which we work, as the saying goes, you had to be there. It's ephemeral, it's lost. It existed for that audience only, and now it only exists in memories or in descriptions. So we really find this very interesting, and we think this represents a very significant and quite profound element of what makes theatre interesting and what makes theatre work. For us, whether we like it or not, the audience at any theatre performance is part of that performance. Whenever we go to watch a show, we are in the show. This has always interested us, and it's always seemed strange to us then that certain forms of theatre simply begin in medias res, as they say, in the middle of the action. A story begins, and as an audience we're expected to just get on board. In a way, this kind of work to us ignores the audience. But then, on the other hand, we've also been a little bit uneasy, or at least curious, about a kind of theatre which very uncomplicatedly says at the start, "Nice to see you, thanks for coming," and then just proceeds into an open, somewhat earnest relationship with the audience. These two extremes, a sort of theatrical solipsism at the one end and a theatrical realism at the other, they both seem to avoid really interrogating the contract between the stage and the Zuschauer room. So we've always searched for something in between, something where the audience feels that they've been cast, that in a way they're acting too, that they are perhaps playing the part of an audience, if that makes any sense. In stark contrast, you see, to watching a show on Netflix, theatre is a form in which the state of mind of the audience has a complete effect on the meaning of the work itself. If the audience feel like they're being asked to assume a role, then the energy and the imaginative landscape of the work is immediately changed. So, as an example, with this in mind, one of our shows from 2013, a show called LIPPY, opens as a post-show talk. The opening line of that piece is, "Thanks for staying behind." And the reason for this, we immediately wanted to ask the audience to act, in a sense, like a bunch of people who've already seen a show, an imaginary show. An audience then is having to do something to lean into the work and to recognize their own presence. Then, after we'd made that show, we followed that up in our next work, a piece called Chekhov's First Play, where we decided to try and push this idea about casting the audience even further still. In this show, we invited an audience member onto the stage and we asked them to play the lead character. So taking a general idea about casting the audience to another much more specific level. I think, to avoid me just talking all the time, I'm going to share with you some video footage. And I think to make sense of that show, I'm just going to play the trailer. So if we could have video 1, which is a trailer for our show Chekhov's First Play.
And we're going to start by doing a little sound check. You should be hearing me in your left ear. And then now you should be hearing this in your right ear. You should be hearing this in your right ear. You're probably wondering why you're wearing headphones. Chekhov's First Play is really complicated and messy. So I thought I'd set up a director's commentary to help explain what's going on, what it's about, and why you should like it.
People just ain't no good. I think that's well understood. You can see it everywhere you look. People just ain't no good.
So as you could hopefully tell from watching that brief trailer, that piece starts as a fairly traditional Chekhov performance, and then halfway through, a member of the audience enters the stage. They follow instructions given through headphones, and they play the lead character. He was the guy in the film who had headphones on and looked like he didn't know where the hell he was supposed to be going. And that's because he didn't. And in that performance, we wanted to explore the gap between performers who've learnt their parts and an audience member who has no idea what they're doing. There's a kind of simple aesthetic interest that we have in this kind of juxtaposition, but really at the same time it speaks to something for us about the paradox and the tension of theatre. If you rehearse something, how can it ever be spontaneous or live? how do you create work that is precisely choreographed and controlled, but then also exists in this strange audience space where things can go wrong and mistakes can be made? We continued exploring these questions when we were first invited to Vienna, to BurgTheater, in, well, late 2019. We made a show which was an adaptation of Sigmund Freud's book Traumdeutung, which premiered in early 2020. This piece actually only played, I think, 5 or 6 times before the pandemic started. But for this piece, we decided to try and take this experiment of casting the audience even further. So not only would we invite an audience member onto the stage, as we had done, but we would also enable them, challenge them, to help us author the show, to help us create the show. So every night, a performer dressed as Sigmund Freud asks an audience member if they want to come onto the stage and tell a dream. The promise, which can't really ever be kept, is that we will interpret that dream live on stage. Now, we can't really interpret the dream, not really, and not in a way that would satisfy Sigmund Freud, certainly not. But we do go on to use the content of this person's dream to create a dreamlike theatrical event. So over the course of the performance, amongst other things, we turn that dream into a pop song, we cast that person as Freud, and then we recreate their childhood bedroom. I've got a very short trailer for that as well. So if we could have a look at video 2, we should have a sense of how that show functions.
Gerade denke ich, schlimmer kann es nicht werden. Da wird es schlimmer. Ich möchte, dass Sie alles aussprechen. Alles, was in diesem Raum passiert, wird vollkommen vertraulich behandelt. Ich schlafe nicht mehr mit dir.
Es war mir nicht sehr angenehm.
Und stopp! Wo sind Sie gerade?
Thank you. So yeah, that person that you see on the stage there at the beginning of the evening had absolutely no idea that they were going to be on stage, and they responded to a completely open, honest request to come up and share a dream if they wanted. So both of those 2 shows present, I suppose, quite extreme examples of this idea I've been talking about casting the audience. But this way of thinking is really central to everything we've done. It's always a question we ask ourselves whenever conceiving of a new project. Why are the audience here? What do they think they've come to see? How can we surprise them or subvert their expectations? And I guess, what do they think it means to be in an audience? So before coming to talk about the pandemic and To Be a Machine, I just want to draw brief attention to another theme that we've explored in our work, and that is about theatre's ability to talk about presence and absence, about being there and not being there. The theatre, I guess, is a place where you're given an empty stage, an empty space, and you're asked to put people into it. Every writer, director, designer, choreographer must first decide how many people they want to put on the stage and who they're going to be, how old they are, how young they are, where they're from, what language they speak. And of course, the inverse of all these questions, or the inverse of the question, who are you going to put on the stage, is who you're going to leave out. The opening line of, I guess, the most famous play of all time, maybe, Hamlet by William Shakespeare, is often cited as a kind of declaration of this conundrum, of this question that the theatre poses. Opening line of that play, of course, is, "Who's there?" And we've always been really interested in strategies that explore how we might use the stage to represent presence, who is there, and then absence, who's not there. We started thinking about this by using techniques like removing the voice from the body. So we did a lot of work with lip syncing techniques to allow a voice to carry on when the person stops moving their mouth. So you disembody the character. We actually went even further than that and removed the body itself. In 2019, we made a show called Beckett's Room with no performers at all. The audience listened through headphones to a binaural soundscape, and they watched a fully realised stage. But instead of watching actors on that stage, they watched the furniture and the props move magically by themselves as though they were operated by ghosts. We've become increasingly interested in technologies and strategies that highlight theatre's unique ability to explore presence and absence. What that often means in theatre, and certainly what it meant for Shakespeare, was that it gives you a chance to represent and meditate on the living and the dead. So I'm going to show another short video, or short sequence of images actually, of another show, a piece called Hamnet. This is a work from 2017. It was named after Shakespeare's only son, who died aged 11 and who Shakespeare probably never knew. We worked on this show with some video design techniques that meant we could represent Hamnet's father, Shakespeare, while also exploring how he and his son were completely absent from each other's lives. So if we could have video 3, which is just a slideshow of some images from that show. The show is a solo work performed by an 11-year-old boy, and he interacts with a live video camera. That's then mixed with pre-prepared video footage. As you can hopefully see in these images, this technique gave us a way to bring a ghost onto the stage. Either the boy or his dad is the ghost, but nobody's sure who's haunting who. And this technique, although the images don't show it so clearly, started to bring the two themes together, because what we were able to do in that show is to film the audience live, and then a particular moment of the show, right at the end, spoilers if anyone wants to come and see it, the audience disappear. So, as I said, we don't have a manifesto. The simple truth that we can admit amongst friends is that we're only ever trying to make theatre that is unlike anything we've seen before. But these two ideas, casting the audience and using the theatre as a place to stage presence as well as absence, do seem to have been central to our creative journey. And both seem to have coalesced as we entered 2020 and, an unprecedented moment arrived for us all, but certainly for the theatre. In March of last year, like so many other practitioners, we had to stop what we were doing. But one of the things we were in the middle of doing was developing a new project, an adaptation of a book called To Be a Maschine. It's a book written by an Irish writer, non-fiction writer called Mark O'Connell, and it's been fairly successful. It's actually translated into German, I believe, and please forgive my pronunciation, but it's Unsterblich sein, which I think is being immortal. In this book, Mark, who is a non-fiction writer and a journalist, meets with a succession of people, real people, who identify themselves as transhumanists. These are people who are committed to using technology to enhance the human body, or maybe actually to replace it altogether. These are people who believe that through technology, humans can transcend what Mark calls the modest problem of death. So in the book, he meets people who run cryogenic freezing laboratories, people who are hoping that their frozen heads can be reanimated at some unspecified point in the future. He meets people who are attempting to turn themselves into cyborgs or robots by inserting technology under their skin. And he meets many, many people who believe, genuinely, sincerely believe, that we will one day soon upload ourselves into the cloud, onto computers, and we will no longer really worry about having a body at all. All the people in the book, all the transhumanists, in one way or another, see the body as a problem, as a piece of defected hardware, a kind of battered old iPhone, something holding back the true software, the information, which for them is where human identity really resides. And so the book ultimately becomes an exploration of what it means and what it really is that makes us human. It's a book about a group of people who stare into the future. A lot of the people he meets in the book really hold quite far out views, and the people who are very comfortable with thinking about 100 years' time, in 1,000 years' time. But suddenly, in April 2020, it seemed to be uncannily speaking to the present moment as well. In that moment, when we were all trapped in our houses for the first time, our bodies had become biohazards. So we decided, in partnership with Dublin Theatre Festival, that we would rush forward with our plans to make the show. We hadn't planned to bring that show in front of an audience anytime soon. We usually try to spend at least a year to create a new work, really ideally longer. But we thought, no, we should rush that process, and we should try and take the opportunity to create something which could exist in a time when audiences were forbidden from entering the theatre. Everywhere, theatres were streaming recordings of old work, and we enjoyed a lot of this. We found it very useful from a professional level. But we wanted to try and make an experience that actually spoke to the current moment as fully as possible. What had been lost wasn't the ability to access content. No, God, humans in the West were consuming more content than ever before via Disney Plus or Netflix or Amazon Prime. What had been lost was the sensation and the meaning of being in a room with a group of other people. What was lost was the fact and the meaning of being an audience. So we set about thinking about how we might bring this project to an audience, and we were forced to think about this, about precisely what we were missing. And we wondered if we could make a meditation on that loss, a kind of, I suppose, lament about the current state of the world and the current state of the theatre, but also maybe a pointer towards what the future might be like, at least according to transhumanists. One thing that they always told us the future would be was something that involved a lot of staring at faces on screens, just like we're all doing now. I remember very sort of compellingly in the early days of the lockdown, there were so many tech utopians who kept saying that the pandemic had just accelerated what was already bound to happen. So as we wondered about how we might make a performance that engaged with this moment in time, we kept coming back to an idea that is discussed by transhumanists and comes up a lot in Mark's book, this idea of uploading yourself. We wondered if this might point to a way that we could try to create a new kind of audience experience. And we came up with a staging idea which seems, looking back, as a kind of intersection of the two main concerns I've been describing, casting the audience and exploring the theme of absence, of not being there. The pandemic meant that the one thing we couldn't do was be together, but maybe there was a new type of audience experience that was centered around the fact of not being together. But in order, of course, for it still to be a theatrical event, we had to find a way for everyone to not be there together. I think the easiest way to try and explain the way the show worked is actually just to show the opening few minutes. This is the opening few minutes of To Be a Maschine, the original version, which premiered in English in Dublin back in October 2020. So that's video 4.
Hello. Good to meet you. I hope you're doing well in these strange times. I know this isn't an ideal way for us to meet. I'm just another face on a screen. You're probably dying to get closer to people, to connect. You probably miss being in a crowded room. After all, that's why you bought a ticket to the theatre. Well, maybe I can help. Maybe there's a way we can be together, even though we're not together. try to forget about the screen you're staring into just for a short while. And try to picture me, not in your laptop, but standing on stage.
Because that's where I am. This is happening live here at Project Arts Centre in Dublin. I'm a little bit nervous, not just because this is the first time I've ever been on stage, but because this is a live stream and things can go wrong. It's worth the risk though, because now more than ever, we need to find ways to connect. And live theatre offers that kind of possibility of feeling like we're in this together. Don't you think?
Totally.
People sometimes say that theatre is a dying medium. And I actually think that's true. It's the dying medium, a place where we die together in real time. So, it's great to be here on Wednesday, the 7th of October at exactly 7:34 p.m., dying in real time. And it's great that so many of you could be here too. It's amazing to see you all like this, bunched up as if around a campfire, side by side with other people, so close you're almost touching, waiting for the show to begin. Looking around, you can see that you're not alone. You're part of an audience. In fact, it's a full house.
Ben? Sorry, Ben, please turn on your microphone. I think it's muted.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I just realized that was my fault. Technology, never trust it. I'm going to go back and say that again. Very sorry.
Thanks, Ben.
Trust the technology, just don't trust the humans, I think is the lesson. Sorry about that. I think that was what in the IT world in English they call problem exists between keyboard and chair. So you just watched that video, and I'm going to go back and explain what you saw. We used Vimeo to stream the show every night for 12 performances. But rather than just create a passive audience experience, and therefore really make theatre that would be competing with other forms of digital entertainment, we wanted to try and replicate as much as possible of the theatre event to create a kind of nostalgic future simulation of theatre. So we wanted to keep a degree of exclusivity, so the tickets were limited, and that's definitely not how the Netflix business model functions. We wanted to keep a sense of liveness, so we used Vimeo's chat function to allow people to speak to the performer. And then most importantly, as you saw in that clip, we created a virtual audience installed every night in the theatre on 100 iPads. So if we look at video 5, it's just a slideshow of images of how we installed the iPads and what that was like. We created a kind of installation, I suppose, in the theatre every night. As we developed the show, and as we saw what this was like, we realised that it would be crazy for the audience to just be shown once or twice. Because, as you can probably see from looking at these photos, the audience is the show. So we used the audience to help tell the story of transhumanism. So, for example, at one stage, Jack, the performer you can see in that final image, steps into the audience and talks to them, and they talk back to him. He's paranoid that there's nobody out there, a little bit like I was 2 minutes ago, and I left my microphone muted. So he does a Turing test with one of the members of the audience to see if they're real. At another stage, the audience play the part of frozen heads in a cryonics lab in Arizona, real frozen heads that exist somewhere in the middle of the desert. And so we had this idea, and the initial hope when we came up with this idea was that this show could all happen live, that we would basically take a Zoom call and distribute it across 100 screens. We later learned that this is basically exactly what the NBA, the basketball league in America, did. But for us, without their finances or their deal with Microsoft, we couldn't do it. We couldn't afford it. It wouldn't quite have worked in the time frame. So we had to settle for a different solution. But then actually, as so often happens, the other solution becomes, in a sense, more interesting. So what happened is when people bought their ticket, they were sent a link to upload themselves into the audience. They were greeted by the performer, who explained that he was going to turn them into an audience member. Each spectator had to record 3 videos, one of them doing nothing, as though they were watching a play, one of them laughing, and then one of them with their eyes closed. People started doing this, and people's videos started pouring in. And when we started to try and manage this process, it turned us from a theatre company into the closest we'll ever get to a tech startup just for a couple of months. Our video designer and technical director created sort of software solutions to try and allow the audience to be assembled efficiently every night. We had to devise ways in which we could gently persuade them to upload themselves without harassing them. We had to find ways of asking people whose videos didn't really work if they could upload themselves again. And what happened, as you'll see from this next video, video 6, is that we generated a kind of backstage process that was very different from anything we'd ever seen before when preparing a normal theatre project. So if we could look at video 6, we can see a little bit of what we did to assemble our audience. This is, I guess, the new pandemic version of asking for someone's ticket and showing them to their seats. And I think you can probably sort of imagine as you look at this, when the videos flooded in and people sent us these videos, we found it incredibly moving. We started to get to know the people who'd bought a ticket in a far more intimate way than we'd ever done before. We saw them in their kitchens. We saw them like struggling to work their webcams. We saw them with their cats. We'd never had this kind of intimate relationship with the audience members in our show, and we'd never really felt that we knew them in the same way as we did here. And it seemed like the formal idea we'd come up with spoke to the aspect of theatre that everyone was missing, this communal experience of being in a room together. By creating a strange simulacrum of theatre, something that was almost like being there, but then also nothing like actually being there, we made an experience that threw up some really strange and surprising moments. The show allowed people who would usually travel to Dublin for the Theatre Festival to be there without being there. People shared their experiences about the show with each other on social media every night, saying things like, "I saw you in the front row," or "Oh my God, I just watched a play and next to me was someone I haven't seen since school 20 years ago." The show connected a little bit, and we took the show to a festival in Liège, Belgium, although broadcast live from Dublin. And then, later in the year, we were invited back to Vienna to create a German language adaptation called Die Maschine in Meer with Michael Maertens. And that version premiered on December 31st, 2020. The process of adapting the show from English to German, it was a first for us. We'd never done that before with one of our own scripts. And it spoke even more really to the theme of art as a kind of algorithm, a set of rules that you follow to obtain a certain outcome. This is true in a play. Comic timing makes people laugh. Tragedy makes people sad. We had a script, so now we could use the same algorithm with a different computer. The show also plays with the idea of acting as a kind of uploading. Jack, in the original performance, had uploaded the character of Mark O'Connell and lost himself along the way. And now, to bring the story a bit more up to date, I'll show you another clip, which is the same part of the show, but this time Michael Maertens uploading Jack, uploading Mark. And it seemed at the end of a very strange year, to be an appropriate conclusion of a journey into the strange and transformative world of transhumanism. So if we could look at video 7.
Hallo. Schön, dass Sie da sind. Ich hoffe, es geht Ihnen gut in diesen merkwürdigen Zeiten. Das ist alles andere als ideal, wie wir uns hier begegnen, über Bildschirm. Wieder ein weiteres Gesicht auf Ihrem Bildschirm. Wahrscheinlich würden Sie lieber Leute so richtig treffen, sich austauschen. Wahrscheinlich wären Sie gern mal wieder mit vielen Menschen im selben Raum. Deswegen haben Sie ja auch eine Theaterkarte gekauft. Naja, vielleicht kann ich Ihnen ja helfen. Vielleicht können wir zusammenkommen, obwohl wir nicht zusammen sind. Versuchen Sie mal kurz den Bildschirm, den Sie gerade anstarren, zu vergessen und stellen Sie sich vor, dass ich nicht in Ihrem Laptop stehe, sondern auf der Bühne.
Denn genau da stehe ich gerade. Das hier passiert in diesem Moment live auf der Bühne des Casinos im BurgTheater in Wien. Ich bin ein bisschen aufgeregt, nicht nur, weil ich hier zum ersten Mal auf einer Bühne stehe, sondern weil es ein Livestream ist und da kann relativ viel schiefgehen. Aber das Risiko ist es wert, denn mehr denn je müssen wir miteinander in Verbindung treten. Und diese Möglichkeit bietet das Theater. Das Gefühl, dass wir das hier gemeinsam erleben. Meinen Sie nicht?
Doch, klar.
Man hört ja oft, dass das Theater ein sterbendes Medium sei. Und ich glaube, das stimmt auch. Es ist das Sterbemedium, ein Ort, an dem wir gemeinsam in Echtzeit sterben. Und ich finde das so herrlich, dass wir heute am 15. Januar um genau 20:05 Uhr gemeinsam die nächsten 45 Minuten sterben. Und es ist großartig, dass Sie alle so zahlreich erscheinen konnten. Ach, das ist ja wirklich irre, wie Sie da so zusammengekuschelt zuschauen. Wie um ein Lagerfeuer, so eng neben den anderen Leuten. Sie berühren sich ja fast. und sie warten darauf, dass es losgeht. Wenn Sie sich umschauen, sehen Sie, dass Sie nicht alleine sind. Sie sind Teil des Publikums. Wir sind sogar ausverkauft.
So, to wrap up and have some concluding thoughts. We began working in theatre through examining the unique role of the audience in a live event. It always seemed to us that the essence of performance was captured in the quality of being there, the combined presence of performers and audience, creating a kind of strange alchemy, a symbiosis that differentiates theatre from any other art form. But the shift to digital performance, which was already underway in the last decade and has only intensified in the global pandemic, brings to light a simple but important question. What is theatre? For some, the live stream innovations offer a broadening of the canvas. For others, it's a false substitute. For some people, it's an intruder, never able to replace the real thing. As it happens, much the same questions are levelled at the claims of transhumanism. Broadly speaking, will technology expand human existence or obliterate it? But the thing is, in terms of theatre, it's undeniable that opportunities have arisen when we're not there. Our audience for To Be a Machine was more diverse and drawn from wider sections of society than had ever previously been the case. Now, the ticket price was lower for a streamed event, so it's probably got something to do with that. But of course, surely the most compelling reason is a simple issue of access. Anyone with an internet connection could watch our show from anywhere in the world, meaning fewer barriers, either physical or more subtle barriers determined by the elite exclusive nature of theatre buildings. Streaming of work is not going to go away, even when full capacity audiences are back in the theatre. I just read about the Young Vic Theatre, a significant theatre in London, today pledging to stream every show from now on. It's possible that the future of theatre will no longer be summed up by that old phrase, you had to be there. Who knows, perhaps one day we'll actually be describing shows to friends by insisting, oh my God, it was great, you had to not be there. Really, the show that we made spoke about the intersection of these two possible futures. And the conclusion that Mark comes to in the book about transhumanism is the same conclusion we'd come to about the strategies that we found. What he describes is that for all its utopian promises and futuristic prophecies, transhumanism's obsession with beating death, transhumanism's obsession with living as long and as happy a life as you can is really just a new way of telling a very old story. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Ben. Actually, thank you for that presentation, that speech, and bringing up all of these parallels to a lot of things that we've been talking about actually over the past, well, yesterday and then the beginning of today. I've got some questions from the audience, and after that I might ask you a question too. The first question I have is, can you tell us more about casting the audience and maybe share some anecdotes about the differences between Austrian German and Irish English audiences?
I will not be drawn into that last one too much. I could speak on it. Yeah, I mean, to speak about I'm aware I went over time, so I'll try and be quick, and please accept my apology for my mute gaffe. Speaking about that very specific case of casting the audience, asking someone to come up on stage, actually, the two shows, it's hard because the two shows I speak about worked in two subtly different ways. The first show, the Chekhov's first play show, the way that functioned was before the show started, myself and Bush would go out into the foyer and ask people if they wanted to be the lead part in the show. And they were allowed to say no and move on, and we eventually found someone who was willing to do it. And we were never interested in trying to persuade anyone, obviously, because it's self-selecting. If they're kind of interested in doing it, then, and if they're willing to do it and they're able to do it, if they know themselves psychologically, then they'll say yes. And if they're not, they'll say no. When we did the Traumdeutung show in Vienna, it was very different because we decided to make it harder. We actually left the responsibility to Alexandra Henkel, the actress, to make that invite in the show for real. And we were told, I won't be too mean about this, but we were told by many, many people at BurgTheater, Viennese audiences will never do it. They will never do it. Nobody will come on the stage. Everyone will be suspicious. No one will do it. And obviously Alexandra and the other performers were terrified because the whole show doesn't make any sense. Okay, we have a plant who's going to go up on the stage if no one could do it. But now I only saw it twice and it's only played 6 times, but every time somebody has got up and done it. The key thing, I think, certainly what we've noticed in Vienna is nobody believes it's real. And this is one of the problems with a trick like this. Everybody, I think even some of the critics, even some of the reviews were like, okay, but it's not real, is it? It's a plant. All we can say in response to that is, if you believe that, come and see the show one night and stand up and tell us your dream. So yeah, I mean, it was actually, I found there was a lot of worry about whether it would work in Vienna, but no, we found so far. And there is, we always say this, we still tour the Chekhov's first play show before the pandemic. And we always say every time when we ask someone to come on stage, and we mean this, there is no right or wrong way to do it. There's no good or bad way to do it. What we're looking for and what we're interested in is the quality of a real human alongside the quality of whatever actors are when they're in plays, this strange kind of amalgamation of preparedness and liveness. We want that at the sort of expertise and complete lack of expertise together, and the human face of a real human being on a stage is impossible to replicate. Look, we're not by no means the first people to be doing this kind of thing, but we do find it continually an interesting way for the audience experience to be abetted or something.
I think one of the things that's really interesting and kind of, I'll let the audience know that you and I talked for a bit last week on the phone. It was a wonderful phone conversation. Thank you for it. And one of the things that I took from that, and also in what you're saying, and kind of what I said before, is that the reason in some ways that theater is perhaps ripe for this maybe is because, like you said, there's no wrong or right way to do it. Because you've got this like set situation, but within that there's so much space for movement and change and improvisation and flexibility, and that works a lot, particularly in this space and in this time that we're in right now as well, actually.
Yeah, I mean, I'm biased because I work in theatre, but I've always felt like theatre has at its disposal. One of the things I love about theatre is that there is no one thing that it is, and it's got the opportunity to embrace any single strategy of art and communication that you can conceive of. It's a form that's about space and time and design and acting and sound and music. And, one of our great inspirations is the playwright Samuel Beckett, and Beckett's task or quest, or one of his quests, was what can you do? How he made a piece called Breath, which was just breathing in and out, or however it works. What can you do to really test the boundaries of theatre? And theatre is very, very, very resistant to those tests because it's proven itself brilliant at enfolding video technology as a very obvious example, And we are seeing now, we were really lucky to make To Be a Machine early on in the pandemic, but over the last 6 months, we've seen really, really interesting and really innovative theatre thinkers bringing their ideas towards the streaming experience and not just the streaming experience, but the lockdown experience. So performances that don't exist in any one physical space, performances that are one-on-one, and that theatre has that in it, that ability to grow and become, its canvas just gets bigger and bigger and bigger, basically. It's what we're always excited about anyway.
I mean, maybe in that way, and something that just occurred to me when you were saying that is that we tend to look at things like film or television as like, this is the perfect thing, this is the perfect medium for the pandemic. Everybody can sit home and you can distance or whatever. But actually it's quite tight. Production is quite tight. You don't have the room for mistakes, improvisation. Nothing can go wrong. And because theater is this very live medium, and it accepts all of those flaws and recreates and creates something new out of them, that it's actually a much more flexible and long-term sustainable art form in some ways than even the medium of like Netflix or something like that.
I think one of the things that occurred to me then is you're talking as well as what theatre has, which is really brilliant, is that it can be made very quickly. There's been a really strange kind of problem. I live in a did live in the UK and now live in Ireland, and there was a strange problem that occurred with television, because how does realism in television talk about the pandemic? You know, how does it reflect this? And it opens up this weird, uncanny gap. We watch soap operas and TV shows and we think they're reflecting the world back to us, but of course they were made 6 months ago or whatever. And so we haven't really had, I don't think, a filmic or a televisual response to the pandemic that has been very satisfying. And theatre has this opportunity to be incredibly fast and to speak to the world that we're in right now. And to speak, because of what you're talking about there, the fact that things can go wrong, the fact that when you're engaging in a theatre act, you're watching people. I always think the simplest way to explain it, in a theatre, someone can forget their lines. And that can't really happen. It certainly doesn't really make sense for that to happen in a film. No. There's not very many art forms that contain the mistake, the live mistake. And what that means is, as we say in the show, we're all sitting in the same space, dying at the same time. You know, it's a slightly poetic and slightly morbid way to observe that. But we, you know, theatre gives us the opportunity to, in real time, share thoughts and meditations about the real-time moment we're all experiencing. You know, so yeah, that's, who knows? Look, we certainly don't come out of this with any big long-term thoughts about where theatre will go, but we certainly feel like we were able to make something that was still theatre. And it's interesting that that was the case.
Because I was going to ask you a question since you don't have any long-term ideas, but I'm going to ask you a long-term idea. If you right now had to think 50 years from now, just your wildest imagination, what could theater look like, or one aspect of it? You don't need to go into like a whole play, but like, what is something that you see that's happening right now that you know definitely, or you feel, no one can know, will remain actually? What will change?
Well, I mean, I guess the response to that, I suppose, is that there is still, I mean, yeah, what will persist is the thing that has, I mean, without sounding like a kind of a lovey, but what will persist is the thing that has persisted for kind of 2,000 years, I guess, in the West, which is the simple act of a person pretending to be a different person on stage in front of you. That seems to be, however many different avant-garde movements have tried to kill that, that seems to be something that is not you cannot really get rid of. So that will definitely persist. I think there's a really big and interesting conversation about accessibility and access and diversity of audiences. And I think there's a big ongoing conversation about, we just found it anecdotally from our show, the simple thing that, you know, we have no idea about, we're still stuck and harnessed to these buildings, which are fabulous buildings, and my God, the BurgTheater in Vienna is one of the world's most beautiful and greatest, but we're still harnessed to these buildings which for a huge portion of our populations are inaccessible, both physically inaccessible. And that's one of the things that streaming has. I mean, I read about this, about the Young Vic in London just this morning as I was preparing for this, and it was uncanny that Kwame Kwei-Armah, who runs that building, was talking about how he was very lucky as a young man because he was able to fly to New York and watch plays. He's British, but he spent a lot of time in America. And he said, that was just fortunate for me. You know, I had wealth, relative wealth, and I could fly to New York and learn about my art. And streaming has allowed us to realize that there could be a democratization of this work spread. Now, of course, the thing is, just filming plays isn't going to cut it. Theatre artists are creative practitioners, so the act of sharing your work internationally will now become a creative one. You will think of how streaming can be built into the performance itself. And you can think of how cameras and so much more than just pointing a camera at something. How can an audience be part of a show that's happening on a different continent? How can people, I think what will probably happen is people will collaborate across continents in a live moment. You know, I'm going off topic, but there's a guy, Teju Cole, who's an American-Nigerian novelist, and he's a big soccer fan, and he talks about the World Cup being this kind of beautiful moment where everyone around the world, he calls it the time of the game, everyone around the world, whether it's 3 o'clock in the morning or 7 o'clock in the evening, whether you're in Tokyo or Lagos or New York City, the 90 minutes of the football match, of the soccer match, is the same time for us all. And theatre for us, theatre is about time, right? Theatre is about spending time with other human beings. So anything that can be done to innovatively spend time across time zones will be very exciting and very important, I think.
That's actually a really amazing way to put that. It's true, actually, this idea of this shared time, ultimately that's what it is. And it's funny, we'll wrap up in a second, but it reminds me of yesterday we had a talk by the architect Greg Lynn, and a lot of what he was talking about also is space. Like this attachment we have to these buildings, these beautiful rooms, these spaces. How do we start to make all of this more accessible, different, rethink space and rethink the movement that's happening in space so that it is a more communicative and more connective experience overall, rather than being this place that you have great reverence to, but you don't want to enter and you don't want to interact with. And it's interesting to see how that also will affect theater too. We actually have to go, but thank you very much. Thank you for being a part of it.
Really nice. Would have had another 30 seconds if I hadn't left my microphone on mute, and I will never live it down. I will be haunted. But thanks so much, Eddie. Really nice to see you, and thanks to everybody out there who I can't see, and hope you enjoy the rest of the time.
Thank you. See you and have a good day, yeah?
Ciao.
Ciao.